Hi, everyone. Welcome to the audience roundtable for the Humanities Podcast Symposium. I'm your chair, Stephanie Garrett, just waiting for a few more folks to come on in. I think we'll probably get started soon. I'll share my screen. So hopefully you should be able to see my screen, correct? Yeah, great. So again, Stephanie Garrett, I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I am chairing today the audience roundtable for the Humanities Podcast Symposium. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves very shortly, but I just wanted to start off by saying thank you so much for joining this particular session about audiences at the Humanities Podcasting Symposium. I have been in a number of meetings this morning, so I missed the initial speeches, but I did want to just make a couple of comments about how exciting it is that this symposium and this conference actually exists and we're talking about this topic. I think a little bit about my background is that I'm the founder of PodDB Inc. and a director of product at a humanities and social science publisher, Sage Publishing, and based in Washington, D.C. And basically, I've been head down for 6 years in trying to really discover how academic audiences in the higher education market can understand and access podcasts for teaching and learning needs. And I didn't know that's what I was head down in doing. It started from a space of, well, streaming video works really, really well in 2014 and 2015 in academic media and academic consumption. Libraries buy large collections of streaming video. Everyone loves podcasts. Can't we just make podcasts academically or available for academic audiences? I found that was not as easy as what I thought it was going to be. And it required a lot more information about listeners that's different from how they consume video content. And the impact that podcasts can have as a medium can be measured differently with your audience because of its evergreen nature, because of the way it's produced, and mainly, I think, which dovetails into the panelists shortly, mainly because of the hosts and presenters of those podcasts, the relationship that podcasters and listeners build together in the audience and creator relationship. It can be measured by downloads, very simply, forgive the ringing in the background. It can be measured by downloads or how many, or the demographics of your audience. But I hope what we can draw out today in our roundtable is essentially some themes around how audience are built amongst the higher ed community, how knowledge is leveraged in podcasts and how it's presented, and how these actual very experienced and very knowledgeable and some of the most entertaining podcasts are speaking about areas of humanities, including the social sciences and including areas of linguistics, rhetoric, history, visual arts, how they're looking at those audience for impact and to grow that audience within the podcasting world and what they're doing. So the way this is going to start, just a little bit of imagery to kind of background this. Again, I'm Steph Garrett. I've executive produced 2 podcasts, but mainly, and one of them is with Darby Orcutt, who is a librarian at North Carolina State University. In that instance, my relationship with audience was that Darby needed to make a podcast for the consumption by his students who were taking a course in graduate studies at North Carolina. So he wanted to make something that could be consumed in the content management system that was being used at his institution. And it was a secondary need for his audience to specifically find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wider listening platforms. And in that instance, it really changed my view of what I thought the impact of a podcast could be, because I had that very industry-wide take of the wider that it's distributed and discovered, the more impact and the goal of the audience is really served. I think what Darby taught me along the way of us creating this podcast together is a podcast can serve an audience in teaching them exactly what they need to know in their graduate studies work. And it can be a companion to their own research and their own presentation, and it can be a way that they understand conversationally exactly how they might end up as the director of the American historical association in 25 years, or what's someone's journey to be the Dean of Social Sciences at the University of Florida. In those instances of conversations that he's having, our target audience was a group of 30 and 40 somethings who really needed to learn the material in a short period of time. And we think we achieved those goals. Now, it was in a podcast format. It was delivered in an RSS feed and it was consumed in the podcast platform, but also it was consumed directly in the content course material. And it was discussed in the context of librarianship, social sciences, and your career trajectory. So that's a little bit of background about me, how I can see podcasts and audiences being used or leveraged in different ways. And I think what I'd like to do is now pass it to for the other panelists to introduce themselves a little bit so that they can introduce what they've done in podcasting to date and a little bit about them in their shows. And then maybe we can have an open discussion for a bit about some of the questions and themes that come up in our creation and relationship to audiences and podcasting. So I'm going to pass this over to Allison Healy first.
Hi, everybody. As you can see from the wonderful visual, I am the host and creator of Art History for All, which, as the title implies, is about bringing art history to the general public. I tend to focus on bringing things to a more general audience, but also including stuff where if you want to dive deeper, if you want to take a more academic look at things, you can certainly, I open the door to that. I've been producing this podcast entirely solo since 2018, after I finished my master's degree in art history at the University of Virginia. And yeah, it's entirely independent, totally solo run. And mostly I haven't dived too deep into analytics or anything like that, but I hear from the odd listener every now and again from, I recently heard from a listener from Germany. I got contacted by some people in India. My friends and family listen to it. So there's a really wide range of mostly people from the general public who listen to Art History for All. So, yeah.
Sorry, the mute button's really hard for me today. Thank you, Allison. It's great to hear. Let me pass it now to Jill. Are you there?
Everyone. Yeah, I'm still here. I'm not sure if I'm pinned on the screen or not, but hey everyone, my name is Gillian Frank. I am the co-host and co-creator of Sexing History, a podcast that explores how the history of sexuality shapes our present. We've been at this I guess we're going into our 4th season now. We've been doing this since about 2016, 2017, and we reach a hybrid audience of both academics and a wider public. Many of our podcast episodes gets tens of thousands of downloads. Our podcast is narrative driven. We are not talking heads. What we do, in fact, is we tell stories using oral histories, archival sound, and create stories and scripts to help give a vocabulary to contemporary audiences to understand sexual politics, change over time, and to recover the voices of folks whose stories might not otherwise be told. So we've covered a range of topics, from the first gay couple to attend a prom and their legal battle, to the histories of phone sex workers, to the histories of flight attendants who fought against discrimination in the airline industry. In essence, what we're trying to do is to give people an understanding of how sexual politics is of national import at a time when these topics shape elections, divide our country, and we've reached audiences across the English-speaking world, and in so doing, have tried to create, I guess, a number of ancillary resources, from teaching guides, which you can find on our website, to published articles in venues like Slate, The Washington Post, and Jezebel, which both draws in new listeners, but also helps transmit our research in new ways. I'm going to stop talking there. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much. Great. And next, Elizabeth.
Yes. Hi, am I here?
Great.
All
yes.
right, great. My name is Elizabeth Thorpe, and I do a podcast called Kairoticast. I am the host and co-producer of this podcast. We've been working for just a little bit over a year and a half on Kairoticast. It is an independent podcast. We're not associated with any school or university. And our goal is we focus on rhetorical ideas. We're a rhetoric and current events podcast. We cover everything from the writing process to superheroes to Supreme Court opinions. We are sort of rhetoric broadly understood. But we also understand that when people hear the word rhetoric, it's kind of I don't know what that is and I don't like it kind of response. And that's okay. That's sort of what we aim to address. Our goal is to show that rhetoric is something that is accessible and is something that can help you understand the world that you live in. Rhetoric is seen as kind of this elitist, effete idea, and we want to show that it is something that actually helps you understand daily life. So we try to make these things accessible and applicable, and that's what we've been working on for about a year and a half. So we're aiming to appeal to a general audience, the intellectually curious people out there. And what we have found is when we try to make rhetorical ideas accessible to the general audience, it ends up being pretty helpful pedagogically as well. So we've had a good time, and it's been a relatively successful endeavor so far.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Now, oh, sorry, this is not the correct name. This is for Ted Fox. My apologies, Ted.
You do have to correct. Oh, the El Perro part.
Yeah.
No worries. Hey, I do a podcast with a waffle as the cover art. So if I'm going to get upset about that, there's a disconnect there. So yeah, my name is Ted Fox. I feel like both Allison and parts of what Allison and Elizabeth said, like you put the two together, kind of sum up my experience pretty well. If you can see on there, I do work at the University of Notre Dame, where I make this show. I, like Allison, I am a one-person team on my show, from everything from pitching the idea to create it to producing it every other week. I started in 2018, just started the 5th season of it. I used to tell people, I mean, I promise there's a reason for the waffle there. I used to describe this show as NPR's Fresh Air plus brunch minus Terry Gross, because let's be honest, no one is Terry Gross. Before the pandemic, I would take my guests out for a meal and we would record the episode right at the table, which really teaches you some interesting things about ambient sound when you go to listen back to those episodes. Since the start of the pandemic, I did an entire remote season last year. I am doing a mix of in-person and remote interviews this season. And really, when people ask me about the types of guests I have on the show, my simplest response is, do I think I can make an interesting half an hour of audio with this person? And I've been fortunate to kind of be able to range all over the disciplinary landscape in order to do that, from pastry chefs to philosophers of science to authors. I have a real soft spot for novelists. So I've, a lot of shows with novelists. I really just tried to make an interesting half an hour of audio that brings some of the intellectual climate of a university to as broad of an audience as possible. So yeah, that's my show, and very happy to be here with all of you today.
Great, thank you so much. And apologies again for the error. And now, Sarah. Is Sarah here?
Hey, yes, I'm
there
here.
She goes. Yep, I lost your box before. There you go.
No worries. Hey, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. My name's Sarah Dugnan. I'm the producer and host of Interdisciplinary Podcast. It's a show that looks at the connections between our foods, our cultures, and our identities, or the disconnections, depending on what we're talking about that week. I started it in 2018. I was in the midst of my PhD. I've been in academia for a long time, but I was also working as a server. I was a single mom. So I had all these sorts of tensions within my own identity around food in particular, and kind of struggling to teach food anthropology while also like working in the service industry, working with food and knowing so many people in food. So my goal with the show is to kind of really challenge how we see knowledge, what knowledge we hold is like important, and to do so around food, because for me, that's always like a good kind of spot to start talking about difficult things with people that might not necessarily always agree with you. And so that's kind of my way of getting into those conversations. So my audience is a little bit of a mix, so geared towards undergraduates to kind of make them think differently about who we're listening to when we're talking about different types of food knowledge. And then also, you know, I wanted my mom to be able to listen to this, not necessarily my mom in particular, but the general, you know, I wanted people to be able to listen who didn't spend time in academia, because I kind of worked between these two worlds. So I wanted it to be informal, but also that other people could learn, and I could share, you know, the different tools that I had through academia with people that didn't necessarily have those educations as well. So that's kind of my little spiel for that.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think I'm going to stop sharing briefly so that we're all on the screen and we can talk a little bit about our understanding. Sorry. Yeah, I stopped sharing. Great. So that was a really lovely intros from everyone to get a sense of your creation and the things that you've made before. So I guess my first question of anyone, I always think about who I originally made my show for versus whose hands it ends up with or whose ears it ends up with. I think one of the questions I would love to hear, for me, it started with, as I said, the graduate students in Darby's program of library science is where it started. But after we had gotten guests from large organizations who were directors and executive directors, they shared it with their friends who were also executive directors at other organizations or societal groups who might have a library background. I actually found that there was an audience amongst relatively senior professionals who wanted to hear about others with degrees in humanities and interesting or innovative jobs they're doing. So it was made for students, but it ended up in professionals' hands that might most certainly had advanced degrees, but that's not why they were listening. They were listening to basically find out what the competition might also be doing and what other interesting or innovative jobs are happening. Has anyone's audience that they originally intended their show for evolve over time, and how? Anyone want to go first from the panel?
I'm happy to go.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, I think mine has evolved in the sense that I started very local. My first season and first few interviews were all people that I knew, like they're people that I worked with in different parts of the service industry. And I'm from Toronto, I'm from Canada. And so that was kind of like my little bubble. And then the audience kind of grew. It's now primarily American, which I always find really strange because I don't like, I feel a disconnect with that. But the audience became more about, like, I found it was more graduate students and teachers that were listening because they wanted to try and incorporate that into their classroom. And so it kind of made me shift even like how I was doing the podcast, because it made me more selective of who I had on. Like, I didn't want to have people coming on and like selling adaptogen teas if I knew that it was going to potentially be used in a classroom setting. So it's definitely shifted the audience, but also the community as well.
That's really useful. I think the local nature is something that I definitely don't. In creating a state-based podcast for a little bit of time about outdoor adventures in Virginia, I was shocked by a month of usage in Alaska and couldn't figure it out for 6 months, but I knew that this person was holding on. And it turns out, of course, it was someone who was born and raised in Virginia, but moved away. But just that one little data point for 6 months kept me really like overly obsessed early days when I was starting to understand who my audience was. So I guess, unless there's any other follow-ups, going in a slightly different question with some of the other questions that we have, what audience do you target as guests? There's a few podcasters here that have guests, and then there are a few that are solo casts, and we'll ask some questions around the solo cast creation process. But when you're thinking about your audience, what type of guests do you think that they want to hear in conversations that you're hoping they'll hear? Sex history and side of knowledge come to mind. That's some interesting conversations.
Sure. Oh, I'm happy to go first, or have you?
Go. Absolutely. Go ahead, Gillian.
Sure. So our podcast basically has guests based on the stories that we are going to tell. So when we did a recent episode on the history of midwifery and the African American community in the United States, spanning from the 1930s really to the present, we got archival sound featuring midwives, but we also interviewed people who were doulas, midwives today, and to incorporate their stories. And so we had another episode on the history of pickup artists, and we got the author of a book, an infamous book on called How to Pick Up Girls. And so each of the episodes, who we speak with is usually someone who is involved in the story in some way. And basically when we pitch an episode to each other, we're a team of about 6 or 7 people right now. The first question we have is there archival sound? And a second one is, who can we interview to bring this story to life, to personalize? And so we're an oral history-based podcast. We do deep dives into the archives as well, and we use these to anchor it. In the past, we interviewed academics. Sometimes these were incredibly fruitful discussions. They shared their knowledge with us. They were able to give, both our podcast credibility and legibility to others in respective fields. But we found that over time that we were branching further and further away from topics that had already been covered in the history of sexuality field, so that we had to become our own experts, or that we found that many academics had a lot of difficulty distilling their ideas for general audiences. There was also a lot of ums, they weren't practiced in speaking. And so we had to, because we're committed to being jargon free, to making this accessible, to inviting curious audiences in who are, savvy, smart, but might not understand the shorthand that we often speak into each other. We found that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze by inviting academic guests on to our show. And so we do that occasionally, we do that very carefully, but right now who we speak with has to do with sort of narrative driven purpose. So we have an upcoming episode on the history of computer dating. And so we've interviewed some computer scientists who created the first programs in the 60s and 70s. That just sort of animates our choices.
And it's really interesting to listen to, Gillian, because I think that is so cool to have like the archival audio and things like that. And I'm thinking Allison can probably relate when I say that one of the reasons that I do my show the way I do is because I am by myself. And I love narrative podcasts and things that pull that in. But if you're looking to start a podcast and you're thinking, okay, what can I handle on my own? An interview-based podcast is a great hack for that, because it does allow you, the more editing and things that go in, obviously the bigger load it is to pull. For With a Side of Knowledge, thinking about guests, like I said, I really do live by that mantra of, if a guest gets pitched to me in particular, do I think I can make an interesting 30 minutes with this person? And I really try to take that from, PhD who's won all these awards, or author who's won a Pulitzer, to someone who is far away from that kind of thing, that would be considered more of a, every person kind of interview. In the time before the pandemic, we were really grounded around the idea of either about a quarter of our guests would be Notre Dame faculty, and the other 75% would be visitors to campus. So it's a great way to highlight some of the conversations we sponsor on campus, and hopefully then tap into the networks of those folks when they go back to their universities or wherever else, to have them, go on and share the show. Last year, producing the show entirely remotely was both a challenge, but it also freed me up guest-wise, because I might find someone on social media who looked interesting and say, hey, would you mind doing this? Or like I said, I love novelists. Like if I'm really enjoying a book, I will find them on Twitter or go to their website if they have a contact and say, hey, I do this show. Would you be interested in coming on with me and talking about your book? So I'm always going for the same general kind of putting myself in the listener's shoes of, or headphones, earbuds, whatever. Would this be interesting to listen to? And then I try to be as broad in that bucket as I can to incorporate, the broadest array of voices I can on the broadest array of topics. And that still is in line with kind of, I guess, the level of conversation you'd expect from a university. But again, there's a waffle, we laugh a lot. So I think that's part of making it more relatable to a broader audience.
Right. I think it's really interesting how both of you or the comparison of the narrative-driven guest filling in the story and evolving or basically putting color to it that you're doing, Gillian, and then Ted, you kind of being guest-driven by the subject matter and material. Ted, how do you know are you going for a theme across episodes over time, or is it really, what's the thing that ties it together for you when you're going down that space?
It's an interesting question to ask me right now, because I am kind of playing with the idea of a themed set of episodes for the first time. I haven't committed to it yet. Mm-hmm. But, when I flatter myself with the fresh air comparison, I try to, the theme is someone interesting that hopefully you will be interested in listening to. And beyond that, I work in our provost office here at Notre Dame, which is the unit that is responsible for the entire academic enterprise. So I'm very fortunate in the sense of I can talk to an engineer one episode, and then I can talk to someone from the humanities, and I can talk to someone from the social sciences, and I can talk to a visiting artist at our performing arts center, and no one's going to say, well, no, that's not really your lane. I've been, afforded kind of a broad lane there. One other thing I would just say too, in terms of, thinking about doing an interview-based show and thinking about the audience is the need, especially working in a higher ed context, to really check your ego at the door. I'm talking to very smart people all the time, and there's such a natural human impulse to want to show off, like, hey, I understand your work, like it makes sense to me. And to kind of what Gillian was saying, of avoiding the jargon and really thinking, okay, if I didn't understand what they just said, chances are someone listening to this didn't understand what they just said. So even if it makes me feel a little self-conscious to say, hey, can you explain that a different way, is probably not a bad thing to kind of put yourself out there. That way it'll make for a better show in the end, I think.
Yeah, I even noticed, I think someone even suggested that they didn't fully understand the guest after the interview was over, and they were saying in their intro, hope you understand it a little bit better, but here's the interview. I think that may have been you, Ted, from one of your older interviews that I was listening to recently.
I have a guess of which episode it would have been. So
yeah, probably.
They'll remain anonymous for the moment. It's been a couple of years, but yeah, I was asking we started talking about multiverses, and I think my eyes just started to glaze over a little bit. So
I think that probably was the one. Gillian, I guess the reverse question for you of, do you struggle to meet what your audiences want when you're going with, is it easier or less easy for you to meet your audience needs because you are narrative based? So forgetting, I guess, the guest element of this, do you think that your audience taste is changing because of the structured storytelling that you've done over 4 seasons and over time? Or how do you think about the delivery of that?
So I think that our sort of idea has been a sort of coherent model of storytelling from the get-go. And our audiences have come to us. We've sought them out in certain ways by sort of cross-promotion, publicity, collaboration with other scholars and podcasts. But on some levels, some folks will skip over a podcast episode because the topic doesn't appeal to them. Other times we'll draw in a niche audience based on a topic. And so I don't think that we have gotten better at the storytelling and the technical elements, and that has helped us improve the overall delivery of what we're doing. But the basic idea of using a narrative to explore a topic and to follow it through over a certain time has changed. Now, certain of our episodes are quite long, close to an hour. Others are closer to 20 minutes and half an hour. And we understand that this will either drive people away if they don't have that sort of commute or listening time, or it might draw in folks who want the sort of longer listen kind of thing. But the sort of numbers have steadily grown over time and then plateau between seasons, or when we have these long lapses. We haven't noticed any sort of friction with it. What we sort of hear from the most are the most careful listeners. I'll give an example. We recently did an episode about priests who came out as gay and then left the church. It was called The Stained Glass Closet. And we had in the background, a big part of our episode is not only doing sort of archival sound, but archival music or very site-specific music to give an ambience, but also to act as a sort of teaser or Easter egg to offer commentary on things. Now, within a day of the episode coming out, it had already been widely circulating among sort of former priests and gay Catholic communities, as well as our regular audience. We heard from a church organist who is, gay, and also said, listen, I've listened to the episode, I heard the music, I love this and this and this, but did you know your second to last song was written by someone who is recently outed as a sex offender? You might want to change that because it carries those meanings and might be hurtful too. And so this is a kind of very specific audience member, someone who is deeply invested in the subject that we often hear from in a particular episode. And of course, we changed the music right away. We did a quick edit to do that. But it sort of spoke to the level of engagement that we were seeing from folks who are not only sort of listening recreationally, but have a deep personal investment in the story. When we did an episode similarly on belly dancing, the belly dancing community was circulating this widely, and we were getting robust feedback and seeing it online too. So this is just sort of the nature of how we've been approximating audience.
Thank you so much. I think it would be really great to hear from the solo cast in this conversation about the relationship with your audience. And one of the things that strikes me in listening to Art for All, a Cast, is listening to, especially with yours, Elizabeth, and I hate to put you on the spot, but also I really enjoy the listening through, is that there is a positioning statement and oral argument / education that is being experienced sometimes under 30 minutes, sometimes in 17 minutes, but it is you and your voice. And there's so many questions to ask about that. But in the context of audience, I would love for you to share your context of how you think about your audience, and knowing it is a solo cast and the creative effort it takes to put into that.
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about my audience over the last year and a half, and it's kind of changed a little bit as I've gotten to know my audience. In the beginning, I just had this broad sense of, well, my audience is just sort of anybody who's listening, and that's not particularly helpful, right? Like as a newbie, I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing. But as I've gone on, I've discovered that there are a lot of academics who are listening, which in some ways surprised me because I'm not speaking at a really high academic level. I'm speaking at a very kind of make this accessible level. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who are listening just because they're really kind of curious about these ideas that are not this is not what people are talking about just at the coffee shop. So I'm trying to bridge two kind of disparate groups here. And that's what's exciting for me. I really enjoy the fact that academics find this useful and interesting because it's familiar territory. But at the same time, there's this other group of people who are finding out, oh, this academic stuff is actually interesting and it can be accessible and applicable. So I've tried to figure out, all right, how do I keep both of these groups of people happy and in conversation? Because that's really what I wanted to do from the beginning, is to show that this stuff is not just navel gazing. This is the kind of thing that can help you understand the world that you live in. And I've really enjoyed hearing from, and a lot of the conversation I have with my audience happens on Twitter. I've got kind of an active conversation going on Twitter, and I hear a lot from academics on Twitter, but then I just hear from kind of people online and various other places, Facebook, wherever, from just whoever happens to be listening.
Academic and journalists, they love Twitter. Yeah,
they're like, oh, I love this, or oh, that was really interesting. So it's been interesting to kind of bridge these two audiences. And that's been really enjoyable for me to watch what I had as my original goal kind of come to fruition and see that everyday audiences really do find this stuff interesting, and academics can make it accessible as well. I don't know if that completely addresses your question, but that's what I've really enjoyed.
And then some. I think that the tension that I couldn't actually clarify when I was first speaking to you is the current events tension that I feel when I'm listening to your podcast, where I'm like, oh, well, no one else is going to cover that. So it's good you're putting it in the context.
I have a very no holds barred approach. I'm like, all right, what could I possibly talk about today that nobody else is going to talk about, that's going to be like, oh, you can't talk about that, I'm going to talk about it. Like, I have not set any limits on myself. And I've always been thinking, well, you know, like I did the abortion episode, and I did the Confederate Monument episode, and I did all of these episodes on things that you would assume the hate mail would be coming in, but it hasn't yet. So I guess I'm doing it all right.
Right. But listenership or audience engagement or growth is still happening as you're publishing?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. I think that's as good as it gets right now in the field of podcasting for other reasons that we could get into. Allison, for you and your solo cast of Art History for All, has your audience had to evolve, or your content strategy evolve I think you have nearly 30 episodes in under like it's some. So did it evolve over time, and was it audience feedback that drove it, or something around having to publish it that changed it at all?
I think to some extent, audience feedback has driven how my content has changed. I remember in particular trying to, I thought, oh, it would be really cool if I could bring in some ideas from like theory. Like I tried to bring in something about Roland Barthes and the death of the author into a particular episode, and got a very clear response from one listener that they felt that it was sort of jarring with the point of the podcast. So I haven't really engaged with that too heavily since, because I was like, okay, that's not what people are looking for from this. I have gotten a lot of feedback that people find my voice calming, which was not a thing that I thought was a thing before I started this podcast. So I've tried to keep a sort of calming vibe, something you can sit back and relax to. People have mentioned that they fall asleep to the podcast. And my audience, I haven't really gotten, at least not a lot of vocal engagement from academia on the podcast, but I do seem to have a lot of undergraduate art and art history students who I am always happy to induct into the world of art history. But really, I'm trying to reach out to the type of people that I used to talk to who were not in academia when I was doing my master's degree, who I would tell them I was working on art history, and they would just be like, oh, I just go into museums and I don't know what to think about these things, or I don't know, am I looking at this right? Am I thinking about this correctly? So I've just tried to always keep in mind the idea that I don't necessarily want to give anyone a prescribed way of looking at something. I want to, try and open doors and prompt questions from people. So yeah.
It's that. Is there a hope that a lot of the episodes, well, when I encountered them, they sounded like they could be things that are pretty evergreen, and over time they could be something that someone refers back to, whereas with the current events and Elizabeth and your podcast, I would say in the moment right now, Allison, do you think you've set it up that way of hoping that the episodes can sit over time, or would you like to go back to some of those subjects for your audiences if things change?
I think that I wanted to try and keep them as evergreen as possible. I did and do try to connect the topics to, because some of these are so extremely niche. My last episode that I released was about a type of Indonesian dagger, which is probably not what people even think about as something artistic. But I always want to try and connect it to, if not like cutting edge current events, then at least something going on in the world in general or in recent years. So I try to walk the line between being connecting these objects and images to the world around us, but at the same time not being so topical that you're like, why am I listening to this thing that's absolutely not relevant anymore?
Yeah. Which is, over time, I think what all of us are figuring out in our long-term or short-term content strategy is, what are we making in it? And is it something we have to come back to or want to come back to, or no? I think, Sarah, your guest and tying it to identity and food and the context that you're bringing around it, this is me asking maybe, it feels like an anthro dish sets up your guest to talk about their subject matter expertise and what they're passionate about or what they're knowledgeable about and have had success in the way that you framed it for anthropology and food and identity. Is that a comfort to them as guests? And is that what your audience is looking for? Because they have wide range of kind of backgrounds as guests, but the way you're presenting them is in this anthropological way that I think you're minding like 4 gaps at once. And I would love to know your thought process and who you're trying to meet outside of the undergraduates in that thinking with your guests over time too.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think for me, the way that I navigate it is that there's kind of 2 types of guests, where I have like academics that are speaking to something that they may have studied or done research on over the years. And then I have people that have like on the ground experience with food or with particular communities. And so it's kind of a twofold for me. For academics, I want them to kind of negotiate where they're coming from and kind of speak to the responsibility of that through the identity lens. It doesn't always happen, but I try. And then with like kind of local knowledge as I kind of see it, I want it to be a comfortable experience. I find like there are some people who don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking or like speaking publicly. I just interviewed someone who has like a personal food blog where she kind of speaks to her experiences post-COVID, losing her sense of smell and losing her sense of taste. Wow. So those are the sorts of interviews where I'm like, I see this as a really important story to share in this particular moment. But you're like, I can tell that there's like a discomfort about coming on and being this like expert. So I try to navigate it through that. And I find it becomes a little bit easier because you kind of, I don't want to say you put a mask on, but you're just putting on like a performed version of yourself in order to talk about something a bit more broadly.
Thank you for sharing that, because I felt like the effort that it must require to present the stories of people who are in non-academic spaces and extrapolating it up to the intellectual or the pedagogical value is not an easy feat. And then I heard you bringing an academic through on their identity, and it sounded painful. But I knew I liked both of them, and I saw you bringing it forward. So that's really interesting. Do your audiences change by the guest, or do you see a difference, or is it, say, pretty similar from episode to episode?
It does depend. It does change based on the guest, I find. I think at this point, I have this like really lovely community of people who have kind of come along through social media. That's where I find like I'm able to have conversations more with listeners and kind of understand where they're coming from. So there is that like general community that listens. But then I find like I did a lot working with different people last season, looking at like the relationship between Sikhism and alcohol. And so that was like a very particular and very large Punjabi Canadian community that started to listen to that particular episode, and then also listen to some other Punjabi Canadians that I had on. And so again, it's like there are very particular communities that come per episode, but then generally there's that like that really fantastic community that's more, I find it's like a lot of like small farmers, like food hobbyists, that kind of people as well.
I understand the global appeal of your show and why it exists that way. So so some of us have 30 episodes, some of us have 100 episodes, some of us have 60, others 10. I think the number of episodes that are held in a show, or how the frequency that an episode is releasing, it can sometimes be informed by the audience and what they need at this time. Have any of you gone through changes in your scheduling to meet your audience need or audience demand, or evolve that over time? Because it was a huge struggle for me to release 5 episodes of a podcast on the same day, because that's how they needed to be consumed. But I know it does happen, and I appreciate when a podcast can do that. But that took a lot of growth for me to understand that I don't own that distribution or how they want to consume it in my audience as much as I want to. So I had to give over to that. I don't know if anyone's experienced that with their audience over time, but it would be great to hear. Sure.
I find, as you noted, I am very responsive to current events, and my audience sort of expects me to be responsive to current events. So I have to be weekly at best. There have been times when I've done an extra episode, like when the Bostock v. Clayton County decision came out from the Supreme Court. I did an extra episode to respond to that decision. I have to be very responsive to the world around me. And I don't always do specific current events episodes. Like my last episode that released just today was about the writing process. It's not always specifically current events, but I am expected to be in tune with the world that we're living in. So I have to be weekly, and occasionally even more than weekly. And that's kind of like, that's the relationship I have with my audience.
That's really helpful to hear, and an enormous amount of expectation that you're growing with your audience. That's for another chat at a different time. Anyone else that's had to evolve their audience, or their delivery or frequency because of their audience?
Yeah, I found when I started, I was aiming to be this like weekly podcast. So I was putting out episodes like every single week from May of 2018 to I think it was like February of 2019, which was, by myself significant. And I remember there was this one woman who was on the show in like the early season who became a fan of the show. We stayed in contact, and she's like, she owns a bunch of different restaurants. She also has like a non-profit about mental health in the food industry. And she was like, it's too much. Like, I can't listen and catch up to all of these because these are like, big conversations. And so that really stuck with